Great. Well, I'm going to start with a question, so get your thinking caps on. What is the best meal you've ever had? Take a moment to think. Oh, we've got some very quick hands up there. Just give people a moment to think. Yes. Shout out nice and loud. Sorry, I didn't quite... Whenever you eat chocolate, that's a strong answer, that's a strong suggestion. Yes, Ed. Christmas lunch, very good. Yes, Bowers. Sorry? Cornish pasties, also very good. Excellent. Yeah, so we were thinking last night, actually, I would probably have said before, where we used to live at college in London, there was a Turkish restaurant just down the road that did just the most amazing meat and really nice bread as well, actually. I know Josiah was very keen on that one as well. But actually, we were at a wedding about a week ago, and we were saying then that the food was absolutely amazing. And food is a great thing. It's a brilliant gift from God to enjoy tasty food, Christmas lunch, Cornish pasties. But no matter how good the food is, within a few hours or so, what happens? We're hungry again, aren't we? Even if we are absolutely stuffed, and we say, oh, if I eat one more mouthful, I am going to burst. By the end of that day, or maybe by the next morning, we're hungry again. Because no food can bring a complete end to hunger, can it? And today's story from John 6, it points back and mentions to two times when God gave people food in miraculous ways. So one is from the Old Testament. Remember when God gave the Israelites manna in the wilderness. It was this magical bread that appeared in the morning. It was miracle food. Psalm 78 calls it the bread of angels. But even then, what do you think happened? They got hungry again, didn't they? The other story is the one we heard earlier. Just one day before, Jesus fed more than 5,000 people with just 5 bread rolls and a couple of fish. But even though it stopped their tummies rumbling then, here, just one day later, they're back again, looking for a bit more. What happened? Their tummies were rumbling again. Even Jesus' miracle bread didn't fill them up forever. So when Jesus starts talking about bread from heaven in our reading, all they can think of is their next meal. We see that in verse 34 there. They say, he talks about bread from heaven, and they think, oh, sir, always give us this bread. They say, it sounds delicious. And so with all that kind of going on in the background, that brings us to verse 35, and that's going to be the main verse we focus on in this section. Because Jesus says, then Jesus declared, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. It sounds like Jesus is claiming to be the best bread ever, the bread of life, bread that puts a stop to hunger forever. I mean, it sounds pretty incredible, doesn't it? But hang on a minute, what's going on here? Because surely Jesus isn't saying he's actually made of bread, is he? No, that's not what he's getting at. So what is with all the bread talk? See, Jesus is taking their obsession with their kind of rumbling tummies, and he's using that to tell us something incredible and amazing about who he is. You see, when Jesus amazed them with the miraculous feeding the day before, they wanted to make him king, we said earlier. but they didn't really know him. They just wanted the stuff that he could give them. But Jesus knows that's not what they needed. They needed to go deeper than this. They needed to understand what Jesus had really come to offer them. So, we're going to have a bit of a think about bread. Now, I've got a visual illustration here. I've got some bread, if I can get it out. Hopefully Morrison's have put 2 plastic bags around it. I'm going to forget the name now. I think this is a Coburn cob. Am I right? Yes?
Coburn.
Coburn, yes. Very good. There we go, local knowledge. So, what does bread mean to us? We've got some bread there on the screen as well. For many people around the world, bread is a staple food, a core part of any diet. It nourishes and sustains. Now, maybe in our culture, things can be different, because we can get by easily enough without bread. There are people that don't really eat much bread. When I said that in the service at Dale Abbey, I got some very cross faces like, no, we really do need bread. We really do like bread. I love bread. But especially for people in Jesus' day, they didn't have that kind of luxury of choice that we do. For them, bread was essential. So for Jesus to be the bread of life, it means he is something essential. He's something vital for life. But he's not talking about physical hunger here. And he's talking about the deeper longings and desires that all people have. Like things like having a purpose in life, knowing what life is all about. Like knowing real love, deep joy and lasting peace. Knowing true and lasting fulfillment and satisfaction in life. And those are things that go beyond just simple physical hunger and thirst. And the search for that kind of fulfillment, it is found in every culture and every people group throughout history. Sure, it'll look different from place to place, but it's still there. And people will look for that fulfillment in all kinds of places. Some will look to their communities. Some will look to themselves. Some will look to money. Some to relationships. Some to power. Some to fame. But here, Jesus is claiming to be the answer to all those questions. The goal of all that searching. He's saying nothing and no one else can meet the needs that he does. I mean, that is a pretty extraordinary claim, isn't it? What a thing to say. And maybe you're sat here this morning and that just all sounds a bit fantastical, a bit overblown. Maybe Jesus has got a bit carried away with his own hype. But the extraordinary thing is, over the last 2,000 years, millions upon millions of people have found this to be true. See, all over the world, in every culture, men and women and children have found that Jesus meets that deeper hunger inside. Giving satisfaction where there was emptiness, joy in our sadness, hope in our brokenness. Just this Friday, I was reading an article highlighting some stories from the past week of Ukrainian Christians finding hope in Jesus in the midst of a very dark situation. This is actually a picture from the news on Wednesday of some Ukrainian refugees reading, I think it was 1 Corinthians, the end of 1 Corinthians from their Bibles. And it was commented that this was amazing, this is interesting that they were finding comfort in the Bible. Then I saw that the Ukrainian Bible Society had put together a video of Christians in Ukraine reading through Psalm 31. And that is an amazing psalm. It's a psalm that speaks of taking refuge in God when enemies are all around. I mean, it doesn't take much to imagine why that is such an incredible comfort to them at this time. And if you can find that on the Bible Society website, I do recommend going to have a look. It's very powerful. See, they have found Jesus, the bread of life, sustaining them and nourishing them. When humanly speaking, the horror of their situation ought really to lead them to despair, just humanly speaking. But that's what they found. They found meaning and hope in Jesus. Now, to use a completely different example, here's a quote I found from Robert Ng, who's a Singaporean billionaire. And he had this to say about coming to know Jesus. He says, "I was always in search for a better life, a better purpose, a better me, a better everything. I was just looking at all the wrong things. But when I realised there is no better me or better things without Jesus. And then it all snapped into place. Maybe we have to look deeper. I treasure my faith more than anything. So I just wish for everyone to have that peace and joy. It sure beats a lot of money and material things that you may have." So that's someone who has great material wealth and plenty. And yet he found that didn't bring satisfaction, that didn't bring this hope. It's only when he found Jesus as the bread of life, who nourishes and sustains, that he found meaning and purpose. I mean, those are two very different situations. I'm not meaning to sort of set them alongside each other, but it just shows the contrast from those in greatest need to those seemingly, in worldly terms, in greatest plenty. But they've all found that Jesus' claim to be the bread of life, it rings true. So if you've never thought of Jesus in this way, can I encourage you to find out more, to explore this further? Why not read along with our Lent book over the next few weeks, which is looking at these kinds of questions. There's copies available at the back. Or when it's available, grab a copy of our Easter booklet, Life That Lasts. I read through it this week and it looks at exactly these kinds of questions. So do have a look at those. Because if Jesus truly can offer this, if he really is the bread of life, well then that's got to be worth looking into. But how do we get this bread of life? How do we receive it? Well, we're going to think about that a bit more later on in the service. About earlier, what did Jesus say that he was? Yes, I saw a hand over there. Can you remember what Jesus said he was? Yes. Yeah. The bread of life. Brilliant. Yes, Jesus said, "I am the bread of life." And we saw that meant that Jesus was saying he could meet all of our deepest needs, our hopes, our need for meaning and purpose, all found in him. It's a huge claim, but one that many people have found to be true. But how do we find this bread of life? How do we receive it? Well, think of the last time you were at a restaurant. You look at the menu and you see something that just looked absolutely delicious. You decide that's what you want and you order it. But that's not enough to meet your hunger, is it? You don't just order and then just head off and leave. No, the food's got to actually arrive at the table and then you eat it. So we've seen what's on offer here. Jesus as the bread of life. But how do we receive it? Well, we're going to look at another verse from our reading to help us get our heads around this. It's verse 51. And Jesus says there, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats this bread will live forever. This bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world." Right, so here's a clue to how we receive this bread. Jesus says we need to eat it. Well, I guess that makes sense. And that is what you usually do with bread. You eat it. But given that it's Jesus that we're talking about here, that sounds a bit gross, doesn't it? I mean, certainly in our house, what do we tell a toddler who likes to bite people? We say, we don't eat people. Certainly that's what has been said a few times in our house anyway. And actually, Jesus' listeners had a similar reaction. Look at verse 52 there. They say, how can this man give us his flesh to eat? It was a pretty horrifying picture. So what kind of eating is Jesus talking about here? Well, just as we saw earlier that Jesus is not saying he's actually physically bread, so this isn't physical eating in view here. And as I was looking through this passage, one thing I thought was helpful was that it's telling two verses alongside each other helps us get a bit of a picture here. So here are two verses, verse 40 and verse 54. Now, as you look at them, what do you notice about them? And you can see that basically the second half is almost exactly the same, about having eternal life, and that Jesus will raise them up at the last day, the resurrection we've just been singing about. And that suggests, actually, that the first half of each verse is also talking about the same thing, the same reality. So eating Jesus' flesh and drinking his blood is kind of picture language Jesus is using to talk about looking to him and believing in him. One is a picture of the other. I hope that makes sense. I think I found that helpful as I was thinking through this. So then when we see Jesus say in verse 51, whoever eats this bread will live forever, he's really saying that anyone who believes in him, who trusts him, will live forever. So that's how we receive this bread of life. It's not by doing anything magic or special or eating anything. It's that we need to receive him. We need to trust in him. So it's like when you finally receive the order you ordered at the food you ordered at the restaurant. You receive it as the waiter or waitress puts the plate in front of you. And then you show your trust in it to see whether it lives up to its billing by putting that first piece in your mouth and having a bite. That's the kind of picture that Jesus is using here. And I think that the reason he uses that kind of evocative imagery of eating is that it shows it's not just about having nice ideas in our heads about Jesus. It's something real that happens to us. We are joined to Jesus as we trust in him, just as food is joined to us when we eat it. So, is that all there is to it? Well, not quite. Because look again, Jesus takes things one step further in the last phrase in that verse. He says, this bread is my flesh, which I will give for the life of the world. Now here, Jesus is pointing forwards to his death on the cross. Jesus, the living bread, is going to give his life for the life of the world. He dies so we can have eternal life. He is cast down so we can be raised up. He is broken so we can be made whole. You see, our sin of looking in all the wrong places to find meaning and satisfaction, of looking everywhere but in God, it's a serious one. And by nature we are cut off from receiving this bread of life. Just like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden were cut off from eating of the tree of life after they'd sinned. You see, it's only by Jesus coming and dying for us, taking the punishment that our sins deserved, that his body is broken on the cross. It's only by that breaking that we can come and receive that bread. But what's more amazing is that bread is then offered to us as a free gift of God's grace. And that's the incredible promise that we have offered to us here. If we take and eat this bread, that is, if we trust in Jesus' death in our place, then we will live eternally with God in heaven. And now, maybe for some of us today, these verses may be very familiar. They're ones we've heard many times before. And just perhaps, maybe we're feeling a bit flat spiritually, a bit disengaged from it all. We can nod along with it all up here, yes, Jesus, bread of life. But maybe it doesn't grip us in here, in our hearts. Maybe not like it used to. And if that's you, well, the challenge here is to take and eat. It's more than just musing on Jesus' words as kind of interesting things to ponder about. Eating means being fully engaged with the reality of what Jesus is saying here. You see, it means allowing this to filter through into every area of our lives. Just as food, when we eat it, the nutrients go to help our whole bodies. And so that means our whole lives being shaped by Jesus and his priorities, with no exceptions. You see, ultimately that's the difference between ordering that tasty meal in the restaurant and actually tucking into the food itself. So if that rings true for you, why not take time this week to pray through these verses? Actually, the readings all through this week in here are through our reading today. Why don't you read through them and pray through them and ask God for a fresh taste of all his goodness, realising in a new way all that he has done for us. Before closing, I just want to think briefly about how this passage helps us think about communion. We're not having communion today, but we will do next week. But with all this talk of bread and of eating Jesus' body, it would be easy to get confused here and think that Jesus is talking about communion at this point. But we've already seen that the idea of eating in this passage, it's a metaphor, it's a picture of trusting in Jesus. It's not about actual eating. So Jesus isn't talking directly about communion here. But actually there is a connection, because these verses, we've just seen, they're pointing forward to Jesus' body being broken for us on the cross. And of course, that's what we're remembering when we take communion, isn't it? That's what we're remembering. So through Jesus' death on the cross, we are joined to him by faith, both now and for eternity. That's both the reality that these verses point forward to, but also the reality that communion, in a really kind of powerful and concrete way, helps us remember. I think hopefully that's a helpful way of connecting those two things. Now, we started earlier by thinking about the best food we'd ever eaten. I hope that didn't leave you feeling too hungry as we tip towards lunchtime. But my prayer for us all is, as we come, that we would come to know Jesus as the true bread of life, that he would bring deeper satisfaction and joy than even the finest food that we've ever eaten, and that we would find in him a joy that lasts both now and every day, but also into eternity. Amen.